Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a look at this thing right here, which has quickly become one of my favorite units. At the same time, I'm not necessarily sold that it's the right unit for everybody, and that's what we're going to get into in today's video review. Now, if this looks somewhat familiar for the regular STH watchers, it probably should, because this is another one of the AliExpress Atom units that is special because this is not a 1 gigabit Ethernet unit. No, this is a 2.5 gig Ethernet enabled unit. And so these 4 ports that you see here are 2.5 gig Ethernet, which is definitely generationally a lot better. And a lot of folks now have WAN speeds, cable modem speeds or whatever that are over 1 gigabit per second. And so you need something, if you're gonna go have a little router or a firewall sitting on the connection, that's faster than 1 gigabit per second. And that's what really these things do. And also they're low power and fanless, so they're pretty darn awesome. There definitely is a trade-off though. And the trade-off is really the fact that number one, these are Atom. These are not like the fastest CPUs out there, although this is a new generation of Atom that we'll talk about. But the other thing is that these things are purchased on AliExpress. And so that means that it's sometimes the ordering process can be a little bit challenging. So that's why I wanted to kind of go and really show you what's inside this one. Now, what's different about this unit versus some of the other ones that we've looked at is that this actually has the highest end, which is the Pentium or Intel Pentium N6005 chip in it, which is still a 4-core, 4-thread processor, but it's also the fastest one that they have. So that makes this kind of an interesting option for a lot of the folks that have seen the other videos that we've done and said, I want a little bit more performance. This definitely has more performance. And so I think that's a pretty good option. And because this is STH, we don't just have the one unit, we actually have 2 units. So I can show you a little bit about the differences between them. These are actually pretty close, but we'll talk about some of the differences because when you order these on AliExpress, frankly, sometimes you get things that are quite a bit different. Now, if you are a regular STH reader and you're wondering, hey, what the heck is up with the background? I realize that both of these units are black. So normally when we've done these units, we've had a black one and a silver one, but both the ones that we got were black colored. And so when we have the TV wall that's black behind me, you just couldn't see it. So I'm re-recording this video. So that way, hopefully that blue will make this contrast a little bit and you'll be able to see it. First though, let's talk about the pricing. And the pricing has actually gone down quite a bit since we purchased these. We got like the absolute first units. I mean, they took probably 5+ weeks to get here. I mean, it took forever, probably even longer than that. And this one is the King Nova unit, and that one we got as a Barebones. And then we got the Top-10 unit, which is one that we got fully configured. Price for these, the King Nova unit was $276, but that didn't include like the SSD and it didn't include the memory or anything like that. The Top-10 unit with a 16 gigabyte DIMM and also a 256 gig SSD was just over $419. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the components, but the plus side is just the fact that this is basically ready to go out of the box, whereas this one you have to do a little bit more work with. So on the pricing side, just so everybody's clear, I actually do think that like all the units that we've been purchasing for future reviews, they're now all bare bones, so we're not actually purchasing them with components inside because frankly, I think the components that are inside them are too expensive, and so I would totally go and get the bare bones one instead. Had I known this, we just kind of figured that out after these things were all ordered. Now in our key lessons learned, we're gonna talk about the value and really kind of what the costs are to go and move between the different SKU levels and all that kind of stuff. But for now, let's get to the hardware and let's just kind of do a quick overview and I can show you how it works. Okay, let's start on this side of the system. And what you'll see is that we have a power button, we have 2 USB 2 ports and 2 USB 3 ports. There are punch outs for Wi-Fi, but this does not come with a Wi-Fi adapter already in there. And apparently you can get them, but we haven't actually tried getting any of the Wi-Fi adapters in these yet. But apparently you could, I guess, add Wi-Fi if you wanted to, or something like LTE. We'll talk about that a little bit later. There's also an HDMI port, and that's what you can use for video output. In fact, when we do a lot of things like, we go load OSs and stuff like that, we use the Tiny Pilot and we actually use that HDMI port plus the USB ports, and we can do things like load OSs and all that kind of stuff on there. There is no built-in management feature like IPMI like you get on a higher-end server, but again, these are low power, inexpensive devices, so that's totally normal. The other side is, of course, the more exciting side, and that's basically that we have a 12-volt DC power input, but then we have 4 ports. Now these 4 ports are 2.5 gig Ethernet, and they're not using Realtek. Instead, they are using the Intel i225V, and specifically they're using the B3, so the third stepping of the Intel i225, because there were challenges with the earlier steppings, and these actually use the fixed or updated NIC. Now, taking a look at these units side by side, they may look very similar, but it turns out that the King Nova one with the kind of more squared off edge or squared off side, that one is actually a little bit larger, and hopefully you can see that in some of the photos and maybe B-roll that we have, but it is a little bit larger than the Top-10 one that we got. I will also say that it's been our experience and others like STH Readers and folks in our forums and stuff, and also on YouTube, where people have ordered things and they've gotten different chassis than they've seen in the pictures. I don't really know how that works, but we've just seen a lot of folks that get different chassis. And the other thing, I mentioned this earlier, is the fact that we have two black chassis. Usually we've been getting one silver, one black, but this time we got two black chassis, and I don't really know how, I don't know why we get one versus the other. They just kind of randomly come to us. Now, I will say the one thing I really like about this King Novi version is just because it has these flat edges, you can actually go put it up on its side and it'll sit on its side, whereas this one, the Topton one, has rounded edges and that doesn't like to sit on its side as much. Now, these both have rubber feet on the bottom of the units, but at the same time, if you wanted to put it on its side, you basically could with this, and it'd be much harder with the Topton unit. Now, speaking of mounting, these systems actually came with these little VESA brackets, and these VESA brackets, they're definitely not they're just made of metal and they have holes in them, which is kind of nice because if you do want to go mount them on the back of like a monitor, but realistically, if you just kind of wanted to mount them under a desk or just wherever the heck you want to go mount something, having a little piece of metal that has some of those screw holes already ready to go is just kind of nice. So I actually kind of like these things, although most of our units are just kind of sitting on desks. One of the other big differences though is just on the bottom of the units. So this is the bottom of the King Novi unit, which you can see just has this little rubber feet, and it just basically has a couple holes for mounting two things. It can either mount the VESA bracket, and you also have the ability to go mount a 2.5-inch drive to this. We'll show you how to do that in a little bit. But the Topton unit is a little different because there are a lot of extra holes there. So you have things like the ability to go and mount like a fan if you want. There's holes for that. And they also have things like they have this like little cutout and stuff like that. And so there's definitely a lot more going on here in terms of, the bottom and being able to cool on the Topton unit versus the King Novi unit. And this is the same breakdown that we also saw when we looked at the N5105 units. So I guess it's just a difference in brands, maybe the bottoms that they're using. And we got some questions on our last video, whether or not these things can actually be used outside. Like, are they really good? Like, these look like industrial systems. I mean, they look like industrial systems, so you can put them outside, right? And the answer to that is absolutely not. There are way too many holes in this thing. It's not sealed. There are no gaskets on it or anything like that. So do not go and put these outside. Okay, so looking inside the system, this is a very familiar layout if you've seen the other videos, but basically what we have is, you can see that we have a little sticker that says that we have the N6005, which is the high-end processor. We have two DDR4 SO DIMM slots. On this side over here, you can see that we have a little SIM card slot, and then we also have, which is right here, the MPCIe slot. You can apparently get some like LTE modems and stuff like that, but we haven't tried it, but the headers are there. The other big difference between this and some of the previous generation ones is that we do get an M.2 NVMe SSD mounting slot instead of a SATA mounting slot. So you do get a little bit more storage performance. So if you're thinking like, hey, I want to run a little bit of virtualization on it, so I need a little bit more storage performance than like maybe a SATA SSD can offer, then that's something that you could definitely go and, you get a little bit more performance with the NVMe SSD. And just because folks have asked before, these things right here, so you can see these kind of like four little chips right here, those are actually the Intel SLNMH, which is the Intel i225V, which are the 2.5 gig Ethernet NICs, and they're the B3 stepping. That's what that means. And so it is kind of nice that we are using the newer stepping, not some kind of older stepping. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Topton unit has that kind of perforated bottom that has the cutout and mounting point for a fan. And if you wanted to go mount a fan, there's a little header, so there's a 4-pin PWM fan header right here that you could use to go add a fan. Now, it's, this system is totally fanless, so it does not have a fan stock, so it means it's silent. It is awesome. But if you do want to add a fan, it's not really too hard to do on the Topton unit. On the King Novi unit, you're probably gonna have to go modify it to be able to put a fan in. Now, some folks have asked, well, how do you go and put a 2.5-inch drive into one of these? And I'm just gonna show you this real quick. So these units both came with the basically same cable, and it basically has a SATA connection and then a custom little power connection. And then you have the SATA connector. You just connect that to a little SSD like this. And now you go install it in the system. Now, I've definitely been doing this in the wrong order, but the three things you basically need to do are you need to connect the power and data to the motherboard, then you connect the SSD, and then the third thing you need to do is put that SSD onto the bottom plate. You just screw that in here, and then you go close it up and you're good. It overall takes a minute or two, and you can get some pretty low power SATA SSDs, so I can see people wanting to do that just to kind of keep the system a little bit cooler. Okay, let's talk about performance. I want to talk about performance in a couple different ways. So the first thing I want to talk about is just where does this kind of fall in the overall spectrum of the other Atom processors? We already looked at the N5105, and that was a pretty significant jump from the older generation Intel N5125, which is an older Atom architecture, but the new 10 nanometer chips are just kind of newer and usually a little bit better. Now, compared to the N5105, the N6005, well, that gets the Pentium rating because it's a little bit faster. And how much faster really kind of depends on what kind of application. The best kind of guidance I can give you is that it's probably somewhere from about 5% to maybe up to about 20% or so. But that's usually the range that we see in terms of the differences between that N6005 and the N5105. We'll talk about the cost implications in our key lessons learned, but the other thing I wanted to do was just kind of test the King Novi versus the top 10 systems back to back. And we ran a whole bunch of benchmarks. They're all pretty similar, and I'm just going to kind of show you like a Geekbench result as an example. And you can see that they are a little bit different, but you're talking about like 1% difference, so they're not super far off. Now, I do want to take a second to just note the fact here that, number one, the chassis, I've always been able to pick these chassis up no problem, even after they've just like, just been operating stuff and picking them up. So I haven't really had any issues like that with heat. They definitely do get warm. I wouldn't go pick them up immediately, but at the same time, I think that the heatsink chassis has been fine for me. What I will also say though, is that we have heard a couple of folks that have bought these and have found that maybe the thermal interface material between the CPU and the chassis have not been perfect. They've seen some kind of weird things. Again, guys, these are bought on AliExpress, so these are not like, some kind of like super version controlled telco thing. There's some variability there. So you may have to go, if you do have temps that are too hot, you may want to just go and kind of reapply thermal paste between the CPU and the chassis. So that would be something just to kind of go look at if you are having an issue. But with our units, we got the performance that we expected, and then we also saw that the performance compared to one another, they were actually very close, and so that kind of leads us to believe that they're basically the same. Now, in terms of networking performance, we basically ran a pretty complex setup, actually. We ran Proxmox kind of as our base OS, and then we put pfSense and also OPNsense. Both of those we've put into VMs. And then once we've had those in VMs, we're able to go and easily switch between, using one or the other. And in either case, we basically were able to find that we could pass traffic through the units at 2.5 gigabit line rate, even with a couple, I think we had like something like 10 or 20 NAT rules in each case, and in every case that there was an issue, we're getting the same speeds. So the basic idea is that I think that for the vast majority of traffic, you're doing pretty well. If you do have some kind of like crazy IDS or something like that, that might be a reason to go get this unit where you have, kind of more performance. But again, if you really need something like super high end, there are things like the Xeon D series that, frankly provide a lot more performance. The Atom C3000 series has more cores and stuff. I mean, there are definitely options out there that cost more but also have more performance. These things are good for being kind of low cost, low power, but they're not necessarily the fastest by any means. And so if you're just kind of running a normal setup, I think these are great. If you're running something crazy, definitely I would go look at a different unit. Okay, so let's talk about power consumption, and let's talk about these things right here, which these are the replacement AC adapters that these units come with. They both output 12 volt, 5 amp, but frankly, what we've had a lot of folks actually give feedback and say like, hey, these things are bad. And so you can get lower power consumption numbers, or people are seeing lower power consumption numbers, and we're seeing just by replacing these units. And frankly, I don't even know how consistent these things are between them. We have a couple of these, but we don't necessarily have a ton of these to actually get a big enough sample size to see if there is a good variation. We have seen some slight differences, just kind of running systems back to back like a watt or two, but just kind of giving you guys an idea that if I were to say one of the things that I'm nervous about with these systems, I would say these replacement AC adapters, these are definitely made to be the least expensive options out there. But what I thought we would do is let's just go and kind of talk a little bit about power consumption. And in the meantime, I'm just going to go plug this thing in so you just kind of can see at least idle, because I know a lot of folks want to see like what idle is, or somewhere around idle, or just, what basically that is, because a lot of firewalls and stuff are running not necessarily at like 80% CPU utilization or anything like that. So I just want to kind of show you just what that looks like. And so that's what we're going to do here. We're just going to go plug this in. And oh, by the way, if you do see the power meter swinging a little bit, the X-Tech power meter is being hung by two steel cables. So pretty much it's going to swing, and there's pretty much nothing I can do about that. Okay, now the number you're going to want to watch on this is definitely the far number over here. That's the one that's going to tell you how much power this thing is really using, at least at the outlet instead of at the input to the device. But we're just going to kind of show you what you get if you just buy these things, plug it in. This is what you're going to see. I know there are folks that are going to say you should use a better power supply, but let's face it, the vast majority of folks are just going to use the one that came in the box. With that, let's go plug this in, and you're also going to hear that this thing will probably beep. One thing I did have to do was go into BIOS, because when I went into the BIOS originally, these things were set to always off on restoring AC power. If you have a Firewall, definitely go into these things and set that to always on, or at least last state, because otherwise power can go off, your internet goes down because it's your router Firewall, and then power comes back and your internet doesn't come back because you forgot that setting and this thing is turned off. Okay, so what you're gonna see is that we are in idle in Proxmox right now. We don't have anything plugged in here. This is just the unit itself, and you can see that we're idling somewhere in that like 10 to 11 watt range. Okay, now we just kind of connected all four to 2.5 gigs. So these are actually doing 2.5 gig links. So these are linked up and they are running, and there's about a aggregate of about 2.5 gigabits per second running across all four ports right now. And what you're gonna see is that we're at about just under 16 watts, but the CPU utilization is super low. The maximum power consumption that we were able to hit when we were benchmarking this thing and just kind of had everything, SSD, just everything that we could, just kind of going maxed full out, we were just over 30 watts total, which is definitely about 6 watts higher than we saw on the N5105 unit. So these do use a little bit more power at idle. They're about the same. When things are plugged in, probably about the same, but then when you start getting into that kind of upper echelon in terms of power consumption, really pushing this, you do definitely see a little bit more power consumption on these. And again, I'm super sorry that this thing is swinging. I don't know what else to do. Okay, now with all of these units, I love to go do the key lessons learned section, because it's like, all these systems, we get these systems, but like, what do they need? Like, why do we even care about them? I mean, what's the big deal? To me, I think that the big deal of this is the fact that you do get the little bit faster processor. It's not necessarily like, a 2x faster processor. I mean, we're not going from like 4 cores, 8 cores, or 6 cores, or something like that. It's still 4 cores, 4 threads, and you get a little bit more clock speed and a little bit more headroom to go up with the N6005. And so you get, maybe 15, 20% multi-core performance better, which is good, especially if you're going to do things like load the system up. If you're just going to run a Firewall, I actually think that a lot of people are going to be happy with the N5105 versions. But if you do want to run a virtualized Firewall and run some other applications on the unit, then I think that maybe this one makes a little bit more sense. Now again, pricing wise, the King Novi Barebones we got for $276, and the topped-in fully configured unit with 16 gigabytes of memory and 256 gig SSD, that one was $419. But looking at the delta between some of these, if you take like the N5095 and you compare that to the N5105, which is actually pretty nice. It's not as big of a jump, but it is a jump. Usually that's like a sub $10 upgrade. And so I say take that one pretty much every time you can get it. But when you look at the difference between the N5105 and then the N6005, which is this one, I mean, there's no doubt that you get a nice performance bump, but at the same time, you're not getting like a huge, I mean, nothing compared to some of the other units that we've seen on the market. But for that performance bump, you're basically paying somewhere in the like $45 to $55 range. Now prices do change all the time. Coupons change on AliExpress. I know, guys, so it might be a little bit different, but the fact is that for the last couple months, we've seen that there's a pretty large gap between the pricing of the N5105 and the N6005 unit. So it basically works out to either buying a fully configured system or just adding RAM and adding an SSD and stuff like that onto a system, is the fact that you're probably talking about something like maybe 10% more in terms of cost, and you're probably getting 15 to 20% more performance. Now, I will say that if you're worried about performance, then getting the N6005 might just make sense, because then you get a little bit more headroom, you don't have to worry about it as much, and maybe for 10% more, so maybe it's worth it on a system basis. If you want a white glove experience where you have folks that are helping you have the ability to get support and all that kind of stuff, and frankly you're not as worried about something like something you got off of AliExpress breaking one day or whatever, then I would go and look at vendor solutions like for a router or Firewall, getting like a Netgate 4100 that we'll have a review of in July. I think that, that would be what I would go do, is get something like that. Now, if you're not a pfSense person, you're an OPNsense person, they have their own appliances. I mean, a lot of folks have appliances, and you can also get things like super micro boxes or whatever. There are a lot of options out there that are, more expensive, but that are also, probably let you sleep a little bit better at night. I will say, though, that we've been running these things for months and we haven't had any issues with them yet, so I'm actually pretty happy with these. The one honorable mention, though, is that if you just really don't care at all about performance, then frankly, don't get this one. Get the J4125 unit, because that thing, just as a little Firewall, like a low-end Firewall or something like that, I think it uses less power, it's less expensive, and so I still think that that's a better option. Now, every time we post a video on 2.5 gig Ethernet, somebody's always like, oh, well, that's silly, why don't you use 10 gig Ethernet? And the reason that we are using 2.5 gig Ethernet as just an industry and as a society, I don't know, is the fact that the same wiring that was installed 15, 20 years ago can still run 2.5 gig Ethernet if it could run 1 gig Ethernet. And that's really the reason that, you know, folks are using 2.5 gig Ethernet, because it's free with the wiring that's already in buildings. If you're going to go and, you know, you want to go put fiber in your building, go do that, have higher speed networking. But for a lot of folks, 2.5 gig Ethernet is going to be what they're going to move to. And nowadays we're seeing things like cheap switches, which we just did a piece on. You can go definitely check that out, where we have a, you know, very inexpensive 8-port switch that's like $116 or something like that. You know, switches are starting to get cheaper, and I think more devices, we're also seeing more devices with that. We're also seeing things like Comcast and other service providers that are starting to provide more than 1 gigabit Ethernet or more than 1 gigabit cable speeds or networking WAN speeds. And so, you know, I just kind of think that 2.5 gig Ethernet, it's about time to start making that switch. So if you're on the fence between a 1 gig and a 2.5 gig, I would personally get to 2.5 gig just so you don't have to go rip it out in a couple months. So hey, I hope you like this look at probably the best system of the low-end systems, if that makes sense at all. But hopefully it did, and you at least learned something by watching this video. Now we do have some other units and different types of units that we're going to be looking at in the future. It's just taken a while to get everything, but we are going to be perpetuating the series, so don't worry about that. And hey, if you did like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.